Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm very excited that we're all here. I'm Peter Murrieta. I'm the Deputy Director of the Sidney Poitier New American Film School at Arizona State. And we are so proud to be partnering with so many great people for this event tonight. So I wanted to just be the person that thanks everybody now so that you can enjoy the show and the conversation, learn a little bit about film and fashion, and we'll get on with it. So I want to really say special thanks to FX Networks for letting us screen the pilot tonight. That's pretty great. I want to thank our panelists, Carlos Rosario, Emmy Award-winning costume designer. I want to thank Hirokazu Kosaka, the Master Artist in Residence at the JACCC. Every time I come, I get a new story from Hirokazu, and I love it. Hollis Goodall, the Curator of Japanese Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. If you've been looking at some of the illustrations that have been on display and will be on display during the conversation, James Casey Holland and Christian Cordella, they were the Shōgun costume concept artists whose illustrations are on display tonight, and that's just incredible. And finally, and I'm going to thank her, but when I thank her, I thank everyone here. Pat Wyatt, the president and CEO of the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. We are so thrilled that we are partners with them, that the Herberger Institute is partners with the JACCC. We're so thrilled that ASU FITM is here tonight, and they have stepped in and are partners with us in this event, and we're just thrilled. So I want to get back there so I can watch one of my favorite TV series of the last year on a bigger screen than in my house.
Ooh, right. My name is Cheryl Boone Isaacs, and I am the director of the Sidney Poitier New American Film School, which is located in the Herberger Institute for Art and Design, dedicated to creativity, dedicated to storytelling. And tonight, we have the honor of some terrific storytellers and how many elements go into projecting the life of a story. And so tonight, we're going to hear even more from the value and the beauty and creativity of costume design and how it supports the story. So please welcome onto the stage our panelists.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see you. My name is Spencer Williams. I'm the program manager for events and student engagement at the Herberger Institute for Design and Arts of ASU in the city that I love, Los Angeles. And I'm also a journalist for film and TV costume design, being the founder of The Art of Costume, in which we celebrate the artistry of costume designers, their crews, and their contribution to storytelling. With that, I'm so excited for tonight's event. Was this anyone's first time seeing Shōgun? Raise a hand. Okay, most of you. I'm jealous. If I could erase my memories and watch it again for the first time like you, I totally would. With that, we have a lot to break down, so let me bring out our special guest and put down my water. All right, so first I'm honored to welcome to the stage Hirokazu Kosaka, Master Artist in Residence here at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. Next, please welcome Hollis Goodall, a historian of Japanese art and former curator of Japanese art for LACMA. And finally, you will know him for his work on many films such as Don't Breathe, The Girl in the Spider's Web, Alien Romulus, a personal favorite, a very successful career as a costume illustrator and assistant costume designer, and of course his Emmy Award-winning work on the epic series Shōgun. Please welcome my friend, Carlos Rosario. Oh, it's so good to have all of you here. It was so fun seeing it on the big screen, too.
Yes.
How many times have you seen it now?
This is my third time, actually. I saw it the first time on my own at home, and then the second time I went to the premiere, and this is the third time.
All right, so it's been a little bit. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad all of you are here. It's a real honor. Carlos, starting with you, looking back on the past few years, from bringing Shōgun to life to seeing this audience response to the series, award nominations, an Emmy win, no, a little brag. What has this journey been like for you? And can you tell us what your first role in show business was?
Okay, so first of all, let me just take a second to thank ASU for having us tonight and the Sidney Poitier New Film School. Of course, this incredible panel, thank you for joining me. And then, the audience for coming tonight. This is very exciting. I would say that this is, once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm still pinching myself that I was able to, get to design the costumes for this incredible project. And I think that, the show itself is so exceptional and so beautiful and so well made. And I've had the chance to work with such incredible team, not just in my department, but all the people that were part of this adventure were incredibly talented and put everything that they had into this project. And the show itself was incredibly creative. And as far as myself as a costume designer, I don't think I've ever worked on a project that was this complete, in which I could feel this alive, designing the costumes for the show. And that creative aspect of the show was incredible and beautiful. But then when the show came out, honestly, it just became very overwhelming to see how beautifully received it was by the audience. And it became, another world on its own. And my intention, since this, it might never happen again, I just decided to really embrace this adventure as much as possible. And so I've been talking about Shōgun for almost 1 year now. And this might be the last time.
This is it.
This is it, But it's been such a great journey, and I'm so thankful and so grateful for this experience.
Right. And he's nominated for a Costume Designers Guild Award, which happens tomorrow. So I think we're all rooting for you.
Thank you. And
yeah, what was that first role in show business? We have a lot of young creatives here, people working in film, fashion. I'm curious.
So I feel like this path has chosen me, because I was supposed to start in fashion. That's what I wanted to do. I studied in fashion in Paris, and then I started in fashion in Paris. But then I came as a tourist in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine asked me if, told me to bring my drawings to Los Angeles. And then somebody told me that there was this union, the Costume Designers Guild, and you needed to get in if you wanted to work in the movie industry. At that moment, I was 21 years old. It was a long time ago. I had absolutely no idea that actually costumes were needed for movies, but I had my drawings with me. I was 21. I had nothing to lose. So I presented my work in the union of the Costume Designers Guild, and I was accepted. And the director of the union became, that was in 96 or 97, became one of the designers on Batman and Robin. And so he remembered my work, and then 2 weeks after being accepted in the union, he called me and he said, "Hey, would you like to do the drawings for Batman and Robin?" And so that was my first experience in the business. I was 21 years old. It was my first job ever. And then after that, once I finished Batman and Robin, I started thinking about, what other designers I would want to work with. And Colleen Atwood was my true inspiration and is always my inspiration. And at that moment, she wasn't as famous as she is now, but she already had started working with Tim Burton. And so I called her, I showed her my work, and then we started working together. And so I started doing all the illustrations for Sleepy Hollow and Chicago and Planet of the Apes, Lemon Snicket. And the great thing at that moment is that the unions were not as strict as they are right now. So, I would be hired as an illustrator, but then, I would do all the research, all the boards for her. And so I was part of the creative process of all those movies. And that really is how I started. She showed me what a costume designer is, and that really sets the vision for the rest of my life.
Wow, what a journey. This is our first time meeting in person, though we've been friends for a little while now, but we met because you DM'd me some of your illustrations from Sleepy Hollow, and then I woke up on the side of my bed 3 hours later after I passed out. So it's crazy to see you in person. So let's get into Shōgun, what we're all here for. Let's start from the beginning. Shōgun is set during a time of transition at the very end of the Sengoku period, which goes 1467 to 1600, which is where this pilot episode takes place. Like you mentioned in the featurette, an era defined by near constant warfare among the warrior class. So how familiar were you with the history when you were taking on this series?
So, this is going to be a little bit shocking. I'm sorry, but I've never put my feet in Japan. I didn't know anything about Japan. I've obviously was, always in admiration of the Japanese culture and Japanese history, and I've always been very inspired by Japanese fashion, and I loved Japanese designers, but I didn't know anything about Japan. But I'm always surprised when, a lot of journalists have asked me this question, and the thing is that that's our job as costume designers, This is what we do. We are given a script, and then we study the script, and our work is to do the research, do whatever it takes to understand that storyline. And then, there is the psychological aspect of the script where you need to understand the characters, and you do need to bring them to life by creating the costumes and creating that envelope that is going to surrender, your characters. But in a way, I feel like it's a very healthy way to design this project, because it's like you start with a white canvas, right? And so I didn't come to Shōgun with any kind of judgment about the Japanese culture, any preconceived ideas of what it should be. I didn't have any baggage or anything. I just came with a very white canvas. And maybe the fact that, I am French, but to Spanish family, I spend more time in my life in America than actually in Europe. And I've been, I speak 3 languages fluently, and I've been working a little bit around the world in different countries with different crews, people that speak languages that I don't speak. It has given me the flexibility to understand cultures maybe more from a neutral aspect than maybe other people that are part of that culture.
Sure.
And I think it was just probably the best way to design this show.
Right. So then what does your research process look like? Are you looking at artwork? Are you reading lots of books? Okay. Where do you even wrap your head around all of this?
So there was definitely a lot of research on this movie. We spent 1.5 years doing research, and I think by the end, one of our producers that was putting all the research together, at the end had a book of a 1,000-page research book. And we were mostly in touch with an expert in the Sengoku period, Frederick Kreens, who actually is not Japanese, so that goes back to what I just said. He's actually Dutch, and he's a teacher at the University of Kyoto in Japan. And he was really the expert that I was really mostly in touch with. And so, maybe we were really constantly in touch until maybe the 2nd or 3rd episode. And after that, we were on our own, right? But what we did is that we studied, because there was no photographs of that period, obviously, we studied all the paintings of that period. And that really helped us a lot in terms of the color palette and the hairstyles and the layerings and the patterns. So that was really our main inspiration, the paintings. Then also we studied the James Clavell novel. And I think something that I want to say tonight, because you guys are coming more from an historic, the historian perspective, is that James Clavell, when he described this period, took a lot of freedom. And so there are a lot of things that were not accurate in his novel. And so that really allowed us to, just kind of play outside the boundaries, the rules of this period. So we studied the James Clavell novel, we studied the paintings, and then also all these characters are based on real people. So we had to study the real people, which was a big part of the design for the armors, And the last thing is that, what was the last thing? I forgot.
I think you got it. It sounds like a lot of work already. Well, I'd love to bring in Hollis and Hirokazu into this conversation. Kosaka-san, after watching the pilot episode of Shōgun, what stood out to you about the setting, particularly the fishing village of Ajiro? What were your first thoughts when you saw it?
I myself was born in fishing village in Wakayama Prefecture. And looking at the fishing village on this film, it's quite a different forest. The trees are different. They had a couple of pine trees, but it's a different species of. It was very detail oriented. So, and then in the forest, I saw some sort of conical trees, but it's not Japanese conical trees. And I noticed that many of the fishermen, their costumes are. Again, it's indigo dyeing, but I thought many of that period were more subdued. And also living with a fisherman in the context of a samurai warrior, I don't think it was that is correct. I think the Buke-yashiki is called. They lived not in the village, but it was a distance away. And I think that some of the interiors, they're painting of a snow scene there. That's 17th century.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a detail on that, looking at that kind of things. Hollis, what do you think about that?
I got wrapped up in the character building, and I love the fact that Mariko was wearing this silvery kimono, and then she walks into a small room surrounded with fusumae, the painted sliding doors of snowy pine trees. And you just felt all of the cold coming through the paintings and through her and her experience. So I was looking at it more as a haole than as a Japanese. And also in that main meeting room in Osaka-jo, it's I think the paintings are based on the paintings at Nijojo Castle in Kyoto. But you never, focus in on them too tightly. So I couldn't really understand, was that Kano school? I just thought it was bunches of fun leaping tigers with, and they went so well with the gold brocade.
Yeah, I know that's right. Yeah. Hirokazu, you actually told me a story the other day about the paper and its relation to this setting. I was wondering if you could tell that story. The paper. Yeah, and Rembrandt, I believe.
Oh, washi.
There was a scene where the Anjin have put his fist in the shoji screen. The washi, many of the Americans, they call it rice paper. There's no such thing as rice paper. It's mostly a byproduct of mulberry fiber. And in fact, I have a room upstairs in the 5th floor that it just shows a screen, but the paper is made by washi craftsman, who is Fukui Prefecture, called Ichiden Washi. And a good friend that he is a 44th generation of paper maker. And that equates to 1,300 years. And in the year 1600, these paper were exporting from a small island called Dejima. Later, it called the Sakoku, the isolated Japan, where Portuguese and Spaniards were kicked out. But Netherlands were there exporting. It's a small island near Nagasaki, the Sasebo area. And between 1607 to 1620, this paper was exporting to Netherlands. And guess who was using that paper? Dutch artist Rembrandt. So if you go to the museum and see Rembrandt's etching or drawings, it's made in Japan.
Wow.
Cool.
Yeah. Which leads me to my next question for you, Carlos. The authenticity and the realism of this series is striking. I think that's one of the big joys of seeing Shōgun on a big screen. So how did you and the showrunners collaborate with consultants, historians, and experts on set to ensure the accuracy and attention to the detail in the costumes, but just the series in general?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of experts for everything. It was a very unique experience because, I mean, mostly, like I said before, I was in touch with Frederick Krantz, but he always stayed in Japan. But then there were experts that came from Japan and that were part of, you know, all the prep and all the shooting of Shōgun. And they were experts for pretty much every part of the show. And each one of them had their own translator. So it was quite an experience that I've never had before on any other show. Usually there is always maybe one consultant, but on this one, there were consultants about absolutely everything. And I think that, you know, Justin Marks, our lead showrunner, might have said, you know, the word authentic like a gazillion million times, up to the point where actually in the beginning he sent an email to everybody in the crew. I mean, there was a big Japanese community on Shōgun, and we had to hire Japanese people, of course, like kimono experts, and you know, to help us with the costumes. But he sent an email to everybody saying that if anything felt wrong to the Japanese actors or the Japanese experts or, you know, anybody that was Japanese in the crew, to actually email him and he would look into it. So it was very important for him to do things the right way, you know.
And that led to, I think, a very successful series. I think we can all agree on that. Hirokazu, the movement of the characters in Shōgun feels incredibly intentional, as Carlos was just referring to, from the way they walk in their costumes to the precise gait of the warrior class within the castle. So can you speak to the importance of these practiced movements and how they contribute to the authenticity of this series?
I myself is a Japanese Kyudo practitioner. In fact, we're celebrating Los Angeles Kyudo here in Little Tokyo, 109th year. The Kyudo dojo was right on top of LA City Hall. I took it over almost 40 years ago, and I teach archery, but we wear a similar kind of a costume that samurai wear, hakama with Monsuki hakama, they call it. But the walking is one of the most important, breathing and the way of the bow. But I think looking at the kimono where the ladies wear, there are layers and layers, and sitting, walking, I'm sure they practice a lot, because the men too, they wore sort of uniform, and also they had 2 katana in their hip. And I think Mishima Ikkyo, who is a writer, mentioned that all Japanese men walk, they seem to like they have a sore in their hip. And they walk in a certain way. Yeah, it is the segment is on no performance, and Hosoryu is performing it. And I could imagine they start age 3, how to walk first. And for me, I learned Kyudo, and my practice walking was around 3 years.
Wow. And I got another question for you, actually. So you've spoken to me before about the space between looking at some of these sets, everything's very spaced out in a very certain way, the buffer or veil within traditional Japanese aesthetics. So how do you see this concept reflected in Shōgun, particularly how characters navigate their environments and relationships?
Yeah, I think looking at entire episode, and it reminded me of Rashomon-esque way of viewing it. It turns and twists in stories. Somebody telling a lie in a way, almost a Rashomon Kurosawa film. And there's a word called Ben-axial orientation. And many of the buke-yashiki, shinzen-zukuri, shoin-zukuri, all these architectural, or even the temples. Myself, my home is 800 years old in Mankoya, and there's no axial orientation to altar or to certain areas. There are maybe 12 to 13 Ben-axial orientation, and where you experience or awaken to a different view. And that could be not just architectural, but it could be the psychic that the warrior have. The notion to become a perfect swordsman, you must have immediate action without intervening thoughts. This is a Zen notion of kill it and just leave. It's the impermanence of all things. Even today, in Buddhist temple, there's a huge hangings gone. It hits and immediate disappears. So this kind of notion is, I think the director really picked up on that sensitivities there.
Right. So Carlos, one of my favorite things about your work in Shōgun is your use of color. I love seeing the indigo blues in the fishing village. You get to Osaka Castle and you see lots of browns and golds. Then you get inside and these beautiful patterns. So how important was color to your process on Shōgun, and how does it help with the character storytelling?
I think it was all about color, actually. And I think the first time they sent me the script, I read the first, this pilot, and what came to me was, right away was I knew that it was going to be a show about colors and about fabrics, right? And the show was so big. There were so many different characters, so many different groups, that I thought the color palette was going to bring harmony, to the visuals, and that would be my way to allow the audience to connect with the visuals by finding some kind of balance where, I would assign specific color palettes to each group, and that would be the best way for the audience to follow the storyline. But that's, it's going back to what I just said earlier, is that James Clavell in the novel described this this period in its own way. And so he assigned colors to each one of the lords. Right. And the first script actually kept that. And that was really the starting point for me to design the costumes for this show, because Ishida's army was described as the Gray Army. Toranaga's army was described as the Brown Army. And so I ended up creating specific color palettes for all the lords, and that's how I started that process.
Sure. And Hollis, from a historical perspective, how was color used in Japan during this period, particularly in art, clothing, and textiles?
It wasn't all that different from the Kamakura period. The color palette stayed the same, but during the Momoyama period, which was 1573 to 1603, if you count the battle at Osaka Castle, or 15, which is when the political beginnings of the shogunate, there was a lot of change because of the presence, for one thing, of the Portuguese. There was bringing in so much material, as you saw in the video, the presence of peacock feathers. Those were from India. They had to be from India. There's a great popularity of chintz and the small patterns also that came from chintz, that also from India. The Spaniards made much of their money on trade from cochineal from Mexico, from a little bug that lives on the cactuses. And so that entire red outfit that the Kiko, I wanted to call her the Yujo, but nobody would know what I was saying. That could have either been dyed with benibana, which is safflower, in which case you have buckets of flowers to make a little bit of dye, or bugs. So either way, it's a horrifically expensive dye, and became quite popular during the Momoyama period as people were showing off their wealth. Particularly, you see a lot of jinbaori, that a vest type a piece that's seen all the way through the film. Oftentimes those were made with red wool, so that's kind of a double Spanish overlay. Wool was being imported. Sheep were not native to Japan. And the red dye of cochineal was also being imported. Also, brown was kind of discovered as a new fashionable color, just as Anjin-sama was putting on that brown kimono. So I was curious why he was dressed so fashionably. But, I mean, in the context, he really stood out because he was brown and everybody else was blue. Also, the one thing about Japanese costuming in general, with kimono, etc., is the genius of pattern matching. The patterns don't match each other, but somehow, when they're put together by a person with exquisite taste, they complement each other, and that really works. I felt in the brocade pieces that you assembled the costumes from. The small patterns called kolmon became popular right around 1600. So a lot of the fashion was very much up to date.
Right. Well, Carlos, I think we could easily spend in like 2-3 hours talking about the importance of fabrics and textiles in Shōgun. So can you talk about the process of sourcing and selecting fabrics in this series? One of my favorite parts from the featurette is seeing how the very intentional no waste with the fabrics, which really stood out to me. So talk about the selection of fabrics.
Well, the thing is that we started swatching, when we started the project, we started swatching in Los Angeles and in New York, and then we went to London, and I had boxes and boxes of fabrics coming to me, and there was nothing that was remotely interesting. They were, very basic, and I didn't see Shōgun in there. Maybe I could use them as underlayers, but I really didn't feel like there was, my characters were in those swatches. So what we did is that we hired a team in Japan that went to pretty much everywhere, and I asked them to send me, like really authentic Japanese fabrics. And, they sent me a box and with bolts of fabric, and each one of them had maybe 10, 11 meters. They were one of a kind, were extremely expensive. And we opened that box, and that's really when I realized that Shōgun was in that box, you know? And so, of course, my budget had to change. So I went to the producers and I said, you know, we might have to change the budget if you want to have a great show. You know, I don't think you would be happy if I would do it the other way around. And I had a meeting actually with the prop master, with the set decorators, with the art department, the production designer, and those fabrics really set the tone for the rest of the show. And that's when we started assigning, you know, the color palette to each one of the characters, finding the right fabrics, and that's when, you know, my characters came alive. But those fabrics really set the tone. And I think in a way it was really beautiful because a lot of the elements that you see on Shōgun are actually coming straight from Japan, you know.
Yeah. Hollis, given the focus on authenticity in Shōgun, how did the choice of fabrics reflect a period and a cultural significance of clothing in 17th century Japan? Were there any specific textures or materials they felt were essential to accurately representing this era?
Well, I was just telling Carlos that the jimbaori with hachiman characters on the back and the black crow feathers and the incredible brocade on the front was a showstopper. Yeah. Oh, I just love that.
It was so rock and roll.
Yeah.
Even the music changed.
Yeah, he was the James Dean of his time.
Sure, he would love that.
But yeah, I've been studying the costume intensively over the last couple of weeks, and boy, you hit everyone. I love that. But one of the things I did want to mention, Spencer, was the Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea of the total artwork. You know, this is something that the Viennese secession talked about in the middle to late 19th century, and that the arts and crafts movement followed with. And there were other followers that came along after that, the Mingei movement in Japan, etc. It started with the Japanese, you know, by the 15th century at least, where everything in the room was part of a total work of art. And the costumes were included as part of that. The costumes, let's say, if you think about a dowry of a samurai woman, the most important things that she brought into the marriage as dowry were her kimono and her lacquer. Oh. And they went together.
Well, Carlos, I actually wasn't going to ask you this, but when Yabu came on screen with the black feathers, it kind of took the air out of the room a little bit. Can you just take us back to that costume? What were you thinking? I heard you say rock and roll a little bit, and I totally get that the second you see him.
Yeah, I mean, I think Yabu is, for me, one of the most fascinating characters on Shōgun. And so, to me, since the beginning, it just felt like he was a little bit off the grid, a little bit, you know, playing his own rhythm, right? And I wanted to do something that was going to allow him to stand out more than everybody else. And that's why I always say, you know, for me, Yabu is a bit of a rock and roll star. He's very complex, he's very interesting, and there's so much depth in there. He's not one side or the other. He just plays his own, you know, his own rhythm. And so that's the reason why I decided that Dan Jimbauri was interesting. And, you know, to go back to what you were saying about because you spoke about the peacock feathers and, you know, this black raven feathers, to me was very important because I was trying to, when I design costumes, it's very important to actually know where the costumes are coming from. You know, so it's interesting to study the period that comes before, but also the period that comes after. And in this case, for the Sengoku period, I decided to study more of the Edo period, and I wanted to amplify everything that was in the Sengoku period that would make the difference with the Edo period. And so for me, the Sengoku period is so much more rustic, so much more in connection with nature. And so I decided to bring into the costumes a lot of natural elements, like the peacock feathers and the black raven feathers, you know, and so that gave me a little bit of that rustic and more organic feel that I wanted for this period.
Right. I want to take a moment to pause for a little bit for some big shout outs. I believe members of the sound team from Shōgun is here, so a little round of applause for them. And as you all came in tonight, I hope that you saw some of the beautiful costume illustrations in the lobby. Costume concept artist James Casey Holland, who's nominated for 2 CDGA awards tomorrow, and Christian Cordella, who's actually here today. Christian, another round of applause for them. Can you just, Carlos, you have a great experience yourself as an illustrator. We talked about your work with Colleen Atwood, which a whole other podcast episode. Can you talk about working with these 2 concept artists, and what does that process look like, especially as someone who's had that experience yourself too?
Well, I mean, I think that, the illustration is the first time that you actually see your vision on paper. It's the first time that it becomes a bit more real. Before that, it's something that is in your head. And words are words. So the drawing is the first specific thing that you can actually show you to your counterfeiters, to your actors, to your producers, to the network. And, that's one of my favorite collaborations. So the way I work with them is that, and every designer works in a very different way. When I talk to my illustrators, I like to be at least at 85% sure of what I want. There are a lot of designers that sometimes just kind of allow the illustrators to come up with, options and ideas and have their own creative process. For me, it's very different. I know exactly what I want, and I give them all the elements, and then they end up doing the drawings. What, I found very helpful for me to be an illustrator in the sense that when I work with them, I allow them to take a little bit of time to understand who the character is. I try to not interrupt them every 5 minutes because as a designer, I'm in the office, with my producers, my actors, my fabrics, and all the elements. I'm in the container of the show, but they are on the other side of the world. And, they need a little bit of time to understand who the character is. So I allow them first to come up with, to understand the essence of the character. And then we start working together and sort of sometimes shifting and modifying things, right? What works really well for me these days is that I send them a lot of WhatsApps. So that way I don't interrupt them every 5 minutes, and so I send them voice messages when I think about something, or even videos, and that way they can listen to it when they are available. But I think that relationship is really, for me, one of the most precious ones. And I've worked with Christian for a very long time, and he's from Europe, so he has more of that European sensibility, and I thought it was perfect for this project because he understands, characters very well, and when you see his drawings, you know very well who the character is. And James is he's from Chicago, he's more specific, very detailed, and works very well with all the different patterns, and he's very precise and very specific, and I definitely love to work with him too.
Sure. Christian, we'll get your side of the story in a parking lot after this. In the pilot, let's talk about some characters. In the pilot episode, Toranaga, played by the great Hiroyuki Sanada, wears many different looks. In the pilot alone, he's in an almost different costume every scene. So how did you use clothing changes to visually emphasize his power and status throughout the series? And also, I think we'd all love to just hear a little bit about your collaboration with him as an actor and producer as well.
So actually, that's a really great question, and I love when somebody notices that Hiroyuki Sanada Toranaga has changed many times in the first episode, because that was actually my intention. It wasn't supposed to be like that, and we were caught with time, and there were so many costumes to do, and everything was coming at the last minute. I just thought that I wouldn't even survive the first 2 days of shooting. But I knew that for the storyline, for the purpose of the quality of the show, Toranaga needed to change at every single scene. And of course, in this first pilot, he has very specific costumes that, needed to be on their own, like the hunting outfit, the ceremonial outfit, the katagino, and, So all those are very specific, but it does change in every single scene, and that was my way, more than all the other lords, my way to show that actually he was, more powerful. That was my way of showing his wealth and his abundance and his, power over everybody else. And, as opposed to, for example, Mariko, who's a noble lady, but, not as of high ranking as those lords, but she barely changes in the first and the second episode, and that was my way of actually establishing that character with that only costume, right? But for Hiroyuki, it was different. I really wanted to create the emphasis, the difference between him and everybody else.
Sure.
And he's a great collaborator, I have to say. He's very focused, he's very concentrated. He's not somebody that needs to go back to his trailer, to understand who his character is. He's always with the crew, always behind the monitor. Great collaborator, very concentrated, very focused, and always leading with respect and with love, with passion, never with judgment. He always guided us and gave us great insight in, for a lot of different things. Him and actually all the other Japanese actors have been absolutely amazing to work with. They are the best actors I've worked with. And, like Fuji, for example, just the feelings with Fuji was just like, she's a poem, and so it was an incredible experience working with them. You could tell already in the fittings that they were all very special.
Yeah, it's a very intimate collaboration too between you and the actors, I'd assume. They were speaking about on the featurette, it's a lot of layers, a lot of weight. Was your team just there through every fitting, just checking, make sure they're comfortable? How does that look?
Yeah, we had kimono experts, that were there, that, were taking care of the dressing aspect of it. But, in terms of authenticity, that's when we needed to really, do a lot of research in terms of the obis, and the obis can be tied in a million different ways. And then you have the cords, and also the cords can be tied in a different ways. And then, the layering also means a lot in terms of the ranking, right? So we needed to understand the language of the clothing of that period, because everything meant something, or the number of hakama of pleats in the hakama pants. The patterns also, and the patterns were associated also with specific seasons, and then within the seasons you have micro seasons, and so we needed to, do all that research in order to understand who our characters were, and since you gave a lot of different examples earlier, I'll speak a little bit about the tabbies, because that was also a great way for me to understand the differences between all the different ranks. Cotton was very rare at that moment and was very expensive, so I only gave cotton tabbies to the Yaechiyo, the prince, the Daioin, the Taiko, and Lady Ochiba, because they were of the highest ranking in Osaka. And then the lords had custom-made deerskin tabbies, and then everybody else was barefoot. So that was my way of, you don't see it much, but it was my way to kind of create differences between all the different characters.
Sure. One thing I love about the pilot, John Blackthorne, he goes through quite a bit of trauma in this episode, I would say. Your poor costumes, the aging and dying was intense. He takes several baths, as you will. What was the aging and dying process like for your team?
Well, that's also one of my favorite collaborations, because I feel like the breakdown, the dying, the over-dying is really what, gives the depth to the costumes. And as a matter of fact, that's the reason why I decided to make the armors in leather, because the leather breaks down very well, and I wanted to make the difference between the leather armors in the Sengoku period and the ones in the Edo period, which to me felt a bit more, shinier and made out of iron. Exactly, and so I wanted to make the difference, and so I chose carefully specific fabrics that we would boil, that we would over-dye, that we would dye, in order to just get that sort of dark and gritty feel that you see in the visuals. And, the interesting thing about the pilot is that, and nobody's going to believe me, but the hardest piece on this first episode was actually the kosode, which the kosode is the ancestor to the kimono, is the kosode that actually Blackthorne wears, that sort of dark burgundy one. because he started with, and that's actually the only piece of the entire show that we had to change.
Oh, wow.
Everything that you see in the show actually is my first option, my first idea. There was one drawing, we made it, it went to the screen. There was never a backup, there was never a separate, we had no time. The only one that we had to change was actually the kosode that Blackthorn wears, because I started with this sort of very rustic silk fabric that was more in the beige colors, but with her hairstyle and everything, it looked a little bit like Jesus Christ. And so when we did the camera test, we were like, okay, this is not going well.
That's
this
wrong.
is not what we want to do. And so I love that fabric, and we dyed it in about 35 different colors and different tones. And so we ended up with that color because I felt that that dark burgundy color was giving me the two things that I really wanted. One is that I wanted him to stand out as still the foreigner, right? But at the same time, I just felt like it was an interesting concept because they take away his identity by removing his, clothes of the sailor, right?
Sure.
And so at that moment, they give him that, that kosode that to me also at the same time felt very Japanese. So it had this kind of two functions, making him look, Japanese. They are imposing on him the Japanese culture, but at the same time, that sort of dark burgundy color made him stand out next to everybody else. So he was still the foreigner, but yes, they were imposing on him the Japanese culture.
Yeah, the aging and dying just brings this series to life. Let's talk about Toda Mariko, played by Anna Sawai, who is my absolute favorite part of this series. I think she's incredible. When we see her in a pilot, you guys have to see all of these episodes because she really goes on a journey. When we see her in a pilot, her clothing is very pale, almost colorless, kind of ghost-like. So how do you approach the evolution of her costumes to reflect her changing character arc, especially in terms of empowerment and purpose?
Well,
Without spoilers, I guess.
well, Mariko is the heart of the show, and so, she's such an incredible character. I fell in love with Mariko, I have to say, and that was probably my favorite relationship of all the actors, was my relationship with Anna Sawai, because bringing Mariko to life was a dream come true for a designer. And the way we started designing the costumes for Mariko was very clear to me, is as I was starting to design all the costumes for the show, I didn't have the time to read all the scripts. Somebody from my team said that in episode 6, Buntaro described Mariko the first time he met her as being very cold. And so that really gave me my first instinct of how to design the costumes for her. So I started doing research on Mariko. She's based on this character called Osakawa Gracia. And so understanding her past and what happened to her family. And so she's been dishonored. She tried to kill herself every time at her birthday, committing seppuku, but she was married with Buntaro. Buntaro didn't allow her to commit seppuku. And so she was sort of living her life without purpose. She lost all her family. Her name was dishonored. And so I felt like the costumes needed to represent that, So I started with that sort of winter-like type of theme. And the patterns that you see on her uchikake actually reflect that. It's the snow covering the grass, right? And so to me, I started with that sort of white canvas, and it gave me, within that container of the costumes for her and her emotional arc, the space to evolve. And slowly, as she found her purpose, her connection with Blackthorn, and her finding her voice and her sense of empowerment, then I started painting camellias on her costumes, bringing life into her costumes, and slowly, as her storyline and her emotional arc unfolds, that's when I started, bringing more bolder patterns, bolder colors. That symbolized, Mariko finding her own empowerment and her voice.
Sure.
So Mariko, like a lot of the other feminine characters on Shōgun, her clothes, more than historically speaking, are based on their emotional arc. And sometimes, as costume designers, you have to make choices. You know, the visuals are very powerful. You have to be respectful towards the period. You have to do your research. But I remember our showrunner saying to us, you know, we have a storyline to tell. We have characters to explain and to bring to the world. So, you know, he would allow us to bring outside of the boundaries of this period in order to tell the story.
Small esoteric side note, white in Japanese culture is a color of transition. So actually that worked out well.
Well, and what I love also is that white is the color of seppuku.
Yeah.
So I love the idea that she started with that color of death, and then slowly, you know, more patterns and more colors start, you know, being printed on her clothes.
It's used with seppuku, and it's also used with marriage. So
Yeah.
these are both transitional.
And that is very interesting. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. No, it's true. And in episode 6, actually, we had a wedding scene. And it's fascinating that we were all torturing ourselves because the experts were telling us that the outfit that we needed to design for Mariko needed to be white. And for us, we always associated white with seppuku. And so we were like, there's something wrong here. But no, in fact, it was true, you know?
Hirokazu, I was going to ask you what your thoughts were of seeing Mariko, the translator, on screen. What did you think of her costumes?
Shina, the word kimono originally came from ki, center of your body, which is in, they say 5 centimeter below your tanzen or your navel. And you know, this particular language, this bushi or the samurai language came, mostly it's present colloquial language came from that period. And for example, when Japanese say, how are you? They say, o genki desu ka? And actually they're asking, how is your ki today? Which is literally, it says, how is your stomach today? It's very important, I think, the kimono and samurai warrior really was very center in the stomach. Seppuku came from that notion of the ki. I think wearing kimono, it have this kind of a spiritual awakening. I remember I wear a Buddhist robe myself, and I sit in a small room and put that garb on it, and I really put myself in that priesthood. When I put my hakama or Monsuki hakama, I become an archer. And I think Mariko and many of the Japanese actors in here, I think they understand that wearing that garb become very spiritual, not as an actor, you know. And so all this, I think, to me, I think it was a very important directorship on the film.
Wow. We only have a couple of questions left, and we're going to be wrapping up. One of my favorite parts of the first episode and the show as a whole is seeing the Council of Regents in Osaka Castle, led by Ishido. How did you visually distinguish the regents from each other while maintaining the historical authenticity to their roles?
Well, I mean, again, that, you know, came down to the color palette. The color palette was the first step towards designing them. Each one of them had their own color palette assigned to them. And as I was starting to look for fabrics, you know, and understanding those characters and doing the research that those characters are based on, then I started, you know, sort of gravitating towards certain fabrics more than others. But a little detail that nobody probably noticed is that that beautiful sort of silver fabric that Ishido is wearing for his ceremonial outfit, for his itatari, actually has this pheasants on top of it.
I did see that.
And so it's interesting because in the beginning, Toranaga is hunting pheasants. And so,
Not notice that. I've only seen this 10,000 times.
there you go. So I thought it was really interesting to pick that specific fabric for that moment.
Yeah, oh, that's sneaky. I love that.
But the other thing that I want to say also is that, for example, the tassels and the cords and everything, they all came from Japan. It was absolutely impossible to find the right width and the right length in America or anywhere in the world. We had to bring them from Japan. They were silk. We had to dye each one of them. The hat that he's wearing, the hunting hat for Toranaga,
Is that a rice straw or?
that was also like a really traditional. We couldn't. It was just for that specific scene, and we needed a few. So we actually brought them from Japan too. Yeah, because it was just too difficult to find them anywhere else or to make them.
Don't find rice straw on the street here.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it was such a specific hat, and actually, believe it or not, that hat, nobody wanted it. Everybody thought that it was just too funny, and the first time that we would see Toranaga, to present him in that way, they thought that maybe that was a little bit too much. But
I thought it was fantastic.
but then exactly as the costume came together and we brought the hats from Japan, the whole thing was just, the silhouette was beautiful, and we decided that it was important to keep it as historically perfect as possible and traditional and respect the Japanese culture.
That hunting costume had been worn continuously since the Heian period,
Yeah,
which is like,
exactly.
wow, he was very gold on the other hand, and then he had fresh deer skin
Yes.
on him.
Well, that's funny about the deer skin, because actually Disney doesn't allow to have.
I was going to say fresh fake.
Exactly. So we had to make fake ones and paint them and break them down in order for him to wear those pieces.
And for our last question, given that our audience is made up of film, fashion, costume students, as well as an incredible community here at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center, what advice would you offer to those just starting out in their careers, looking at the pilot episode of Shōgun? Are there any key lessons or insights you've gained from working on this series that you believe are important for aspiring creatives here in the audience?
Well, I mean, I would say that costume design is a very complete type of work. There are a couple of different aspects to it. One is very psychological, one is very creative, and one is more mental, more intellectual. The creative aspect of it is that I would say that, of course, and I think everybody here is started the right way, is that going to school and creating a strong foundation is very important, because sometimes people start in fashion or in costumes, without any studies. But I think it is important to know everything that you can about textiles, about history of clothing, about even, I'm a pattern maker, so even though I don't work as a pattern maker, I know how to direct my cutters. Illustrations, because it's a great way to start sort of putting on paper your ideas. Learning about architecture, so that's all the creative aspect of it. The technical aspect of it is more business-like, and as a designer you need to shift from the creative aspect to the business aspect. So there's deadlines and budgets and all that, and that also is a very important thing. And then the last one is the psychological aspect, which has to do with creating your characters. And I always say that being a costume designer is really not about the clothing aspect. It's more about that distance between the heart of the character and the outer envelope, and that has to do with perception and intuition, sensibility, and all that comes from maturity. So the more you know in life about anything, about the human condition and different layers of human beings, and therapy, and culture, and traveling, and about knowing about life and the world, the more you'll be able to understand your characters. Sure. It's a little bit like the iceberg. I feel like costume design is not really about what you see. The tip of the iceberg is really about the hidden part of the iceberg. And I think that comes with knowing about life. So I would say that it's a beautiful work because it has all those different components. And so that would be the advice that I would give them. And in terms of what I learned from Shōgun, I would say that you know, the same thing happened in the miniseries that was done in the 80s. For many months, and I don't think it's very diplomatically correct to say this, but for many months there was a lot of clash between the Japanese community and the Canadian community, right? It took a lot of time for everybody to come together. But what I take from this project is that we try to create bridges between all those very different cultures, and the beautiful visuals that we created is because of that friction, because everybody was coming from different perspectives. I think Canadians and myself were more conceptual. We look at the big picture, and the Japanese community and the Japanese actors are very detailed oriented. So it was beautiful to actually look at Shōgun from the big perspective and knowing how to execute it, but also looking at it from the ground up and looking at the roots and looking at the details. And even if you don't see it on camera, it was very important for the Japanese community to make sure that everything was perfect. And so that's what I take from me, from Shōgun, is the fact that I was always more focused on the big picture, but I incorporated in my work, all the details. And that I learned from the Japanese culture.
Sure, and being able to collaborate with every department, production designers, writers, directors, it's one big family, and you all really came together.
This show definitely was a very big collaborative effort, and that's something that I want to say is that as a designer, you need to put your ego to the side. I think the best advice that I can give anybody is that as a designer, you are of service to your characters, to your director, to the storyline. It's not about your little idea and being proud of it. It's about, making sure that the community is happy with what you come up with. And so you need to back up and just let your ego to the side because you're of service to everything that is creatively unfolding on the project.
Well, that brings us to the end of this panel. Please give a huge round of applause for Hirokazu Kosaka, Hollis Goodall, Carlos Rosario. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center for being such great hosts, and my colleagues at ASU for making this happen.